The most influential newspaper in the English-speaking world is, without a doubt, the New York Times. With a print circulation of 1.3 million, it claims a global online and print audience of 5 million. But its reach extends far beyond those numbers. It sets the ideological tone not only in the US, but in most of its Western allies too. Its editorials give world leaders marks for good behavior or stern advice on how to mend their ways. Pundits thrash out the imperial consensus on its opinion pages, and its reporting shapes US perceptions of the outside world. One US journalist claimed that it is scarcely an exaggeration to say that the Times defines public reality. Another paid tribute to its godlike powers, saying that an event it doesn't cover might, in a manner of speaking, just as well not have happened. Established in 1851, the Times has aspired to this definitive status for most of its history. Its front page has, since 1897, featured the slogan, "All the news that's fit to print," and in 1927 it started calling itself the paper of record. It soon acquired another nickname, though, which originally referred to its lack of images, the Grey Lady. These days it could hardly be accused of visual austerity. Colour photos and graphics adorn the many sections of the physical paper, while the website is a never-ending torrent of feeds, graphics and videos. But the paper retains an old-fashioned quality in its layout, narrow columns of print scrolling down the front page, and in its weirdly genteel New England cocktail party mode of address. It would never be so uncouth as to refer to anyone by just their surname. It's Mr. Obama, Mrs. Merkel, and Ms. Kardashian to you. Similarly, on the one hand, the paper is resolutely up-to-date in its choice of headquarters. In 2007, it moved to a Renzo Piano glass and steel skyscraper on 8th Avenue. But on the other hand, it has effectively remained under the same dynasty since 1896, when the Tennessee press baron Adolph Ochs bought a controlling stake. 4 generations on, Ochs's great-grandson, Arthur O. Sulzberger Jr., is chairman of the board. In 2009, worsening finances led the paper to sell a $250 million stake to the Mexican billionaire monopolist Carlos Slim, but the Ochs-Sulzberger family still owns close to 90% of the company. When he took over the paper, Ochs laid down its guiding principle: to give the news impartially, without fear or favor, regardless of party, sect, or interests involved. Over the following century and a bit, the Times claims proudly to have stuck to that principle, setting a gold standard in news. Between them, Times reporters have won 114 Pulitzer Prizes. And indeed, the real problem with the Times isn't in the quality or individual ethics of its reporters. No, it's in the paper's claims to impartiality, to even-handedness. Because in practice, the Times has always been desperately deferential to the interests of those with power, and dismissive of the lives of those without it. The apparent commitment to balance is an ideological smokescreen behind which the Times continues to serve the same masters as always. Ochs's noble principle, without fear or favor, was proved hollow before the ink was dry on his editorial. His purchase of the paper had been bankrolled by financiers including J.P. Morgan. Shortly thereafter, the Times coincidentally took up their political agenda by attacking William Jennings Bryan, the populist Democrat candidate in the 1896 presidential election. And the Times has shown plenty of favor over the years, most of all to the US government. In the early 1920s, it sat on an oil scandal to avoid embarrassing the Harding administration. In 1954, it helpfully pulled its correspondent out of Guatemala shortly before a US-engineered military coup. During the Cold War, in fact, the paper provided cover for 10 CIA operatives in its foreign bureau. Its lead foreign correspondent in the 1950s and 60s was Cyrus L. Sulzberger, a scion of the paper's ruling family, who was considered an active asset for the agency, codenamed Fidelis. There have been moments when the Times has gone against the imperial state's interests, most notably in 1971, when it published the Pentagon Papers, revealing that the Johnson administration had lied systematically to the public about its actions in Vietnam. But this was, of course, several years after the events in question. At the time, the paper showed few qualms about the war. According to John Hess, a Times editor for 2.5 decades, several of its reporters in Vietnam eagerly picked up weapons and shot civilians themselves. In 2003, Hess published an insider's account of his years at the paper, savaging its preference for mediocrity and conformism, and what he called its allergy towards sources that challenge the establishment's truths. He gave a pretty devastating summary of its stances. The newspaper of record recorded a century of the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind, generally as a faithful voice of the Eastern establishment. It supported all its wars, hot and cold. It supported witch hunts during and after World War I, and temporized with the one after World War II. It fudged the menace of Hitlerism and played down the Holocaust. At the cutting edge of major events, it could be found against women's suffrage, against unionism, always, against minimum wages, and national health insurance. And the list goes on. Hess's memoir came out as the US was invading Iraq, a war that brought another remarkable low point for the Times, whose editorials eagerly beat the drums from early on. In mid-September 2002, the Times asserted that the combination of Saddam Hussein's weapons programs and his brazen defiance of the Security Council represent a serious threat to international order. A couple of weeks later, a leader bearing the title A Time for Debate and Reflection concluded, with no apparent sense of irony, that no further debate is needed to establish that Saddam Hussein is an evil dictator whose continued effort to build unconventional weapons threatens the Middle East and beyond. Over the following months, the op-ed pages hosted a stream of pro-war pundits, from Michael Ignatieff to David Brooks to Kenneth Pollack. Bill Keller, soon to become the paper's executive editor, had already written obliging profiles of George W. Bush and Paul Wolfowitz. About Bush, Keller argued that in the alchemy of politics, stupid can be smart, while his portrait of Wolfowitz was admiringly titled The Sunshine Warrior. Keller cheered the invasion of Iraq from the sidelines. "Let's hope the war is a quick success," he wrote on 22nd of March 2003. But, as Howard Friel and Richard Falk argued in their book on the Times and US foreign policy, wryly titled The Record of the Paper, the problem went further than the op-ed pages, seeping into the Times' news coverage. In the run-up to war, reporters like Judith Miller just regurgitated information backing the case for invasion that had been handed to them by US government officials and Iraqi exiles, most of which later turned out to be false. Worse still was the sickening triumphalism of some of the coverage. On 4th of April, John F. Burns observed that American air power is a terrible swift sword that strikes with a suddenness, a devastation, and a precision in most cases that moves even agnostics to reach for words associated with the power of gods. There's a staggering combination of maniacal arrogance and weaselly evasion here. Think how many people were killed by that precision in most cases. The Times became more dubious about Iraq as time went on and casualties mounted, and it has grown slightly more reticent about recommending intervention elsewhere. Nonetheless, the paper has been appreciative of Obama's so-called strategy for dealing with ISIS, describing it as a plan full of hope. By now, you'd think there'd be a moratorium on using that word in connection with Obama, especially given the cancerous expansion of the security apparatus he's presided over, with its worldwide program of extrajudicial executions. In summer 2014, the paper finally conceded that, for all the slick technology, there are grave moral and legal questions going unanswered in the government's use of armed drones to kill people considered terrorist threats. The solution was not to change the policy, though. More regular reports and Pentagon oversight would do just fine. On Latin America, the Times has sometimes adopted what look like progressive positions. It opposes the US embargo on Cuba, for example, and a mid-October editorial praised the island's efforts in combating Ebola. But where it matters most, the paper stands squarely with the establishment consensus. It has described both Hugo Chavez and Nicolás Maduro as corrupt and autocratic, and when Evo Morales was re-elected as Bolivian president in October 2014, an editorial published simultaneously in English and Spanish attacked the new generation of caudillos in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador. The Times op-ed pages are a platform for constant attacks on left and center-left governments by intellectuals such as Enrique Krause, Mario Vargas Llosa, and Jorge Castañeda. Then, of course, there are the columnists, whose pontifications are crucial to the paper's identity. On domestic politics, Maureen Dowd, Joe Nocera, and Charles Blow all work very hard to let the Obama administration off lightly. There's Paul Krugman, carrying a Keynesian torch in his economics columns, Nicholas Kristof, breast-beatingly concerned about the fate of Africa, and hey, women too, Roger Cohen, worrying about the waning of American power, and so on. But pride of place goes to Thomas Friedman, whose twice-weekly columns simplify everything into bite-sized banalities for politicians and execs who can't be bothered to actually find out anything about the world they run. This June, for example, Friedman noticed that the acronym for the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS, contains the same letters as the surname of the Egyptian president, Sisi. Hey presto, a column about two forms of Arab misrule almost writes itself. In September, he brilliantly solved the problem of whether the US should lead from the front, like Bush in Iraq, or lead from the back, as Obama apparently did on Libya, suggesting instead that it should lead from within. Shazam! The power of metaphor. More recently, Friedman expertly analyzed the forces of disorder spreading across the Middle East and West Africa by quoting a chunk of dialogue from a Batman film. Though even this bizarre bit of cut and pasting wasn't Friedman's own idea, but that of an Israeli military expert he regularly quotes. The apparent diversity of views on display in the paper is central to its modus operandi. Look, there are ideas circulating here. There's debate, democracy even. The Times' claim to be balanced, to describe the world without fear or favor, is what makes it such an effective weapon in the media arsenal of empire. When one set of forces, interests, states, or people is vastly stronger than another, treating the two even-handedly obscures the fundamental reality. Kurt Vonnegut described the Times as a mighty crowd control engine, but it's more like a magician, making the real structures of power vanish before our eyes.